Do you have a slide?
So we'd like to welcome you to the next section, which is a lecture followed by a performance by Georgios Papadopoulos and Carsten Lisecki. So, excuse me. Georgios Papadopoulos combines economics and philosophical analysis with an exploratory artistic practice. His research gravitates around money and its socio-economic functions. He has published in scientific programs, art reviews, and edited volumes in English, Greek, and Spanish. He has also written notes towards a critique on money, a monograph on the nature of money, and an edited volume on the Euro crisis entitled Brexit, and it's right over there. So Georgios Papadopoulos will introduce Carsten Lisecki. Thank you very much for this section.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? I have to. So first of all, I'm very happy to be here. I would like to thank the organizer for having me, nGbK, and of course, my collaborator, partner in crime, Carsten Lisecki. Carsten is a performance artist, painter, filmmaker, and we have been working together already for maybe like 3 years, since the Brexit project.
Since the Brexit stuff.
And today I'm going to do something that usually I don't do. Usually I come and talk either as an economist or as an artist, even though I'm not really an artist. This is kind of a shaky position for me. So we have 1 hour, so there is a lot planned. And the lecture is going to be in 3 parts. So first, I would like to reflect a bit on the discussions that happen here and discuss a little bit this link between activism and arts that is so central in our meetings. On the second part, I will talk a little bit about my work on money. And I think somehow this relates quite well with the discussion previously by Gunther, because my critique of capitalism, or the market, or the economy, if you like, focuses on the money form rather than the commodity. And this is somehow a big departure from the traditional Marxist, post-Marxist discussion that focuses on the commodity form, alienation, exploitation. And the third part would be a small text that I have written. And somehow, usually I don't read text because I have a problem, I'm a stutter. And today I hope I will do a better job. I've really tried, prepared, and I think you could understand something. But it's really important to read the text, and I have also some copies, but happily there are many of you, so you have to share properly the text. And this text is somehow my experiment on creative writing, but focused on economics. So I use a very kind of famous technique developed in the 60s by Brian Geisen called cut-up. But I use this technique to write like a text on the crisis. And somehow I think this is also a comment on the discussion and very much relates to my first analysis of the relations between activism and art. But before I start, I have to do something on my PowerPoint. It will take only a second. Maybe not only a second. I'm not here. Well, we'll have to live without this video. Anyways. And we are set. So somehow there is this kind of assumption that politics and art go very well together. And we see that quite often, or this assumption is very much celebrated in the recent years. And of course there is this kind of cataclysmic effects of the crisis that we all experience to a lesser or a bigger extent. And this somehow infected discussion in the arts. So we see like famous left-wing thinkers appearing in art contexts, Adam Badiou, Jacques Rancière, just two names that come from the top of my head. But also events like the 7th Biennial that was discussed yesterday, or the coming documentary Learning from Athens. But also in the more Greek context, the last two biennials, Monodrome and Agora, very much address these issues. But my concern has to do with how this politicized, or if you want, over-politicized discourse, how effective it is as a political strategy. Because if, let's say, art could be seen as a way to do politics, this should somehow change the relations of power inside the art world, in the process of producing art. And so my critique, and I have to make a parenthesis here, is not just a critique of the art, it's also self-critique. I'm an economist, I have come to the art world somehow, invited or uninvited, and I'm very much, how do you say, responsible for the kind of, or guilty of the charge that we just started to describe. So on the one hand, we see that even though we have this strong tendency towards Marxist theory, critical theory, if you want, still the conditions of artistic production remain very much precarious and exploitative. So even though the artists and the art institutions are very much reproducing a discourse that comes from the left or the far left, still the condition of production of the artists remain the worst I would say, in the labor market. Artists are the last to get paid, they are not insured, they are not unionized. So for me there is a very big gap between this kind of very leftist discourse and the everyday life of the artist. This is, I think, the first problem. The second problem is that I see this kind of, let's say, critical art somehow very much sponsored by institutions that you would not expect to pay for this art. If they will really take our discussion for seriously, and they would think that this is actually what we believe and what we do. And if this kind of, let's say, critical discourse had a real impact in social life, I wouldn't expect that the German state or the Goethe Institute will pay for this kind of critical art. And the third, and somehow this is kind of very much a Greek phenomenon, is that there is a small touch of post-colonial politics that I would like to point to. So we have all this kind of funding funneled from German institutions and foreign institutions to foreign artists coming in Greece, producing discourse, and then producing their own idea of the crisis in communication with their Greek colleagues, of course. But it's them who have the institutions, the infrastructure, and in the end of the day, it's them that they produce the discourse about the crisis in Greece abroad. So there is a kind of unequal exchange where foreign artists come with their money and their resources in Athens, they work with the Greek colleagues, but then they come to present the work here. And somehow I want to praise this the organizers, because they invited so many of us here. And in a way, to return the compliment, I also invited a very good German artist to work with me. And this somehow wraps up my first part of the talk. I have to say that it's, at any point you can stop me and ask questions, except on the last part of the performance. Carsten, would you like to say something?
Yeah, thank you for invitation, and we are proud to present our performance here. And I was one time in Greek with Georgios together. We did this in Empress Hospital Theatre. It's occupied theatre there, and yes.
So as I said in my short introduction, my work or my critique of capitalism or the market somehow very much connects to the question of money. The first video I show you is a work by a friend and a colleague, Juliana Boriski, and the name was 1 + 1 = 0. And this very much connects with the cover of the book, which is a euro sign turned to a 0 also. And this is a work by a French collective called Société Réaliste. And this idea of putting this in the cover, or this idea of depicting the euro as a 0, relates to my analysis of money as an empty signifier. This idea that, let's say, money is kind of the self-referential and empty representation of value. And somehow this organizes very much my thinking, my understanding of economics. The starting point of the analysis is that the economic system is a system of meaning. And in the core of the system of meaning, there is a big hole, the hole of value. So the very fact that value is self-referential creates the possibility of, let's say, organizing commodities as a system of signs, where money plays the role of an empty signifier, a signifier of an empty concept, the concept of value. And the idea of value being somehow empty and self-referential relates to this distinction between natural and social concepts, natural and social roles. So other measures that we use to count or to compare or to quantify, like weight or length, are not self-referential in the sense that they exist in nature. So length is a natural quantity. The same goes for weight. But this doesn't apply with value. And this is very interesting because this is the first line of attack against, let's say, the economic system. The fact that the economic system lacks, so to say, a natural measure points to the fact that we cannot have an objective construction of value, an objective construction of the market. And here I would like to somehow outline the different lines of attack that I try to wage in my critique of economics. And the first has to do, of course, with value that I already discussed about. This idea of value being something that is irreducibly social. And this irreducibly social character of value is somehow regulated by money. And exactly because of the role of money to be the quantifier in the economic system, makes it also for me a privileged element of attack. A second line of attack against economics has to do with, let's say, philosophy of science, epistemological address of the economic science. This idea of science as a separate and inexact discipline. And I'm just now outlining the structure of these different attacks, and I will be elaborating a little bit further, so please bear with me. The third question, or the third point of criticism against the economic system has to do with this more structuralist understanding of the economy as a system of meaning. The idea of the economic constitution of society through a system of prices. The third has to do with this idea of psychoanalysis, and the fact that psychoanalysis can provide us the tools to understand how the psychological investment of the individual is conditioned or is enforced in the market system. The fifth part of my attack has to do with an aesthetic kind of analysis of money and currency, and how the ideological tropes of the market and the capital are already depicted in the representation of value and currency. And the last, which I'm not going to talk so much about, but somehow has to do also with the work that I've done with Carsten, has to do with this embodiment of, let's say, the mandates of the market in the individual in a very basic somatic level. And here this critique is both, I would say, discursive, but also somehow more practical. I was working in the past quite a bit on dance and how, like, the body is disciplined by the market, how specific kind of gestures or movements somehow communicate or this kind of discourse, and how to let's say, disengage from this kind of disciplinary regime through kind of an affirmative biopolitics against the market. I talked about value, but let me just go back to this question, because I think it's extremely central for my argument. So the starting point of my analysis is this kind of resistance to this idea of value as a property of an object, this idea that there is something ingrained in commodities that makes them valuable. What I would argue, I would say, following Zimmel or Kant, is this idea of value as something that has to do with the individual intentionality. And in that sense, my analysis is not very much different from this kind of more traditional economic ideas of desire or utility, where the individual is the source of valuation. But where my analysis somehow deflects or departs has to do with the fact that I don't subscribe to this analysis of the market as a mechanism that objectifies value through this process of exchange. And this somehow brings me to the second point of criticism, this idea of economics as a specific separate science with very restrictive assumption. What economics tells us, and that's also what Gunther said in the previous discussion, is that there is an equilibrium. So supply and demand come together, and a price is calculated in the market. And the fact is that actually economics, or mainstream economics, argues that this can be proved mathematically. So by spelling out specific, very restrictive assumptions, economists have proven mathematically that we can have an equilibrium. This equilibrium is unique, and this equilibrium is somehow the optimal outcome in terms of social welfare for the society. But the catch, of course, is that in order for this to work, we have to assume or to accept these assumptions of the economic science. And here is somehow descriptions of these assumptions. By providing these assumptions, the economic discipline constructs a vision of the social where only certain kind of factors are predominant. And these factors has to do with rationality, maximization, productivism, the returns of scale, consumerism. And by constructing this kind of social ideal, they produce somehow the equilibrium which is actually implicit already in the assumptions that they're making. So this has to do with the fact that economics, even though it argues that is applicable in the society as a whole, makes very restrictive assumptions, and in that sense, it constrains the domain of its application, brushing away all these kind of disturbing factors. That's why there is this idea of describing economics as a separate and inexact science. Separate because it creates a specific domain of application, and inexact because it can produce these results only under these very restrictive assumptions. And when we don't have these restrictive assumptions, as is in reality, then the equilibrium solution cannot happen. Moving to structuralism. How does the economy can be understood as a system of meaning? How does the economy can be understood as a symbolic order, if you would like to use this term? There is this idea that money reduces the qualities of commodities, of relationships, of social facts to the absolute quantity of money. So makes everything commensurable to everything else, and somehow economize the social system, and then symbolizes as the system of prices. And then after this movement, we can have this kind of economic system of valuation, we can have equilibrium, we have everything. And here's the very important role of money. Money is the quantifier. Money is the unit of account that reduces everything else to this absolute quantity of value. And if we go back to this idea that value is not something objective, we can see how this kind of idea of money as an empty signifier could function as a tilting point of the symbolic order, as the point that somehow reduces and brings together uniformity to the economic system. And this is somehow like this characteristics of the master signifier, this idea of dominance, eminence. This is a little bit discussion on structuralism, but I think this is somehow looks and reads nice. But I'm not going to expand more on it. This is my pride. So this is a bit kind of a Mickey Mouse structuralism that I came about with my book. And what I'm trying to do here is somehow combine this analysis of the commodity form and then expanding it by putting money in the equation. And there is this kind of half arrogant, half playful comment that I make in my book, and it's also in the title of the book, that relates very much with a critique of political economy. So there's this idea of Marx wrote a book on the critique of political economy, and then Baudrillard capitalized or built on this book, and he wrote a book with a critique towards the critique of a political economy with a sign. And what Baudrillard did is brought structuralism and Marxist criticism together in order to, let's say, provide a structuralist critique of economics. And what I try to do is to take this analysis a step further by introducing the money form in the equation. So we have the traditional system of signification, the relationship between signifier and signifier, the commodity form, and then I include the price form by referring money to commodity, and then by combining my utility and exchange value, I go to the price form. This is somehow also a teaser about this idea of, let's say, why I'm moving away from the commodity and going back to money. And now we're getting closer. Psychoanalysis, another theory that I try to use and abuse in order to pursue my argument. And here things are somehow more clear or more easy to create connections. The equation I was trying to make is, okay, we have the economic system, we have the dominance of money, we have this kind of signifying operation of the economy and the market. But, you know, there is always this kind of tradition of uncovering this and criticizing this, and, you know, a lot of, it's nowadays, this kind of Marxist critique is not only known, but to a large extent accepted by many people. But still, we keep doing this. We really like this kind of, there is this kind of love-hate relations between the economic system and individual desire. And why does this happen? So here I try to suggest that there is something in our introduction in the market that has to do with subjective desire. And I would, here there is this assumption that, again, comes from psychoanalysis that says the object of desire is always somehow elusive. So we have a difficulty of articulating what we really want. And in the end of the day, what we want is to keep the system of excitation that is called desire. And this is exactly somehow what the market does to us. This idea of promise of enjoyment and always in the next commodity. So we buy this and then we want that and then we want the other thing. This idea of postponement of enjoyment keeps the subject desiring and the economic system working. But there is also this other flip side. There is not only consumption, but there's also production that is somehow supported by this kind of psychic libidinal economy. There is this self-actualization of the individual through employment, this kind of mandate of the market where valorization is also understood in terms of money. So we have a double investment, both in consumption and production, that is somehow marked by money, by interception of money in the participation in the market. Last but not least, my work on the aesthetics of currency. And here, in order to put the argument in a kernel, what I try to do is somehow to read how the symbolic and iconographic elements of the euro can provide us with a reading of the crisis. And the starting point here is this kind of Lusserian idea that technological apparatuses like the monetary system produce specific images that can give us an understanding of their constitutive ideology. And by that, by using this kind of assumption, I thought, how could we read the euro as kind of image or, let's say, message, latent message of a crisis to come. And there is this very interesting relation of tension between Greece as this imaginary foundation of the European culture, which is already referred to when the European Central Bank produced the glyph of the euro, said that the glyph is this kind of E with the double lines. And this is an exact quote. What the European Central Bank said is that the glyph of the euro is inspired by the Greek letter epsilon, which is also the first letter in the word Europe. And there is an added second line to point to the stability of the new currency. So it's very interesting that Greece, on the one hand, is referred as the source of the identity of the new currency, but at the same time, now that Greece is facing these difficulties, is the one to be blamed for and to carry the burden of the whole crisis. So we have this very tensive position where Greece on the one hand has to be referred to, but at the same time is the other who has to carry the responsibility of the crisis. So now it's the pop part of the So I have a few texts, if you want to pass them on. Well, I will need one to read.
I have. But if it's too much, I can help you.
No. Carsten is going to do the final, so bear with me. I have to apologize in advance because I'm very bad at reading, but I have to do it. On Saturday afternoon, a meow from across the offices anticipated the crisis. Oh. Well, I guess the slideshow is going its own way. So on Saturday afternoon, a meow from across the offices anticipated the crisis. The conference room on the 31st floor revolved around predictions, imaginary spreadsheets, and primitive physical narcissism extending across phone lines and monitors. The soul of the year 2008 hollowed out the body's entire symbolic potential. Its millennial heresy importuned to predict a third quarter loss of 3.9 billion. At that very night, the Lehman technicians looked disarmingly glare, trying to settle in with their scripts and their papers. Christine Lagarde arrived with a plan inherited from the scientific mythology of the 19th century. But overnight, Asian stocks had slid, and the euro was even lower. Italy has no credibility, Mrs. Lagarde told the group of death. It will send the wrong sublimation to the markets, as if she knew what nothing was. Silvio Berlusconi, the genius Italian prime minister, imposed all sorts of arbitrary fashions. For years, he left his chief financial officer without hedging a Darwinian process. In the successful exchange against death, Mr. Papandreou reasoned on topologies and energetic calculi. Consumption good, he muttered. But many had lost confidence to the interpreting machine. The Greeks attempted the impossible, to cause a legitimate illuminated between one and the same law. Strict budget rules, domesticated under sign of death, for nothing can include opposition to the law value. Positive machinery as crisis, the worst contradiction of productive forces. Communist of a hostile hammer horizon to be conquered by science and techniques. The kingdom's animism jostled in an assembly time the goodwill from investors, many of whom came from the other side. The IMF
had picked the work of the unconscious itself. Preserve life as it is cheap and easy to, as long as it is cheap and easy to propagate. Turn away from secondary processes of appropriate responses to the crisis. Psychoanalysis as a vindicated prophecy and unappreciated reinterpretation of the symbolic. Freud does not think this is what he said in his entire critique of economics. We die because it is a habit, continuously. Life itself must leave the being unconscious. I had appears to be a finality. And the printing presses of the European Central Bank read this high-quality global denying that is true of our culture. To perform, as they learn from the forces of the tobacco strategy historian perceived the term, provoked a triumph of the same instance in solidarity with the political economy. Our German government also demanded equilibrium, and preferably a unique equilibrium. Everyone was returning at last, hoping that a settlement might buy the economists. Historically, it is time that implements economic reforms, and when the history of the Eurozone crisis is written by libidinal economy, it will be like a ferocious superego. It is going to be reductive to the core of the unconscious. Radical processes that are a negation of the sign of value in a politico-militaristic way. Need should be delivered on public history of transactions, rejecting work once escrow mechanisms made from digital signatures are put in place. Speaking of Freud's overvaluation of forward growth, along with all psychologistic culture, the death drive is beyond the circumscription of the physical as such. You cannot cut up materialism in your head. Squash all immediate impulses. Spectacular power at this time of panic idolizes an ambiguous and baseless exit. Natural light, extending beyond its ways, might force the masses. People restructuring history in an acute political antagonism in which they deprive you the choice of center-right. Magic can only be the oven of alienation. Tiny political cultural communist for communists at rust. The guerrilla has no real when it perceives class struggle. The avant-gardes of final analysis cut through the world as an agent. Possibility leads to no effort. Avoiding mediating dispute with this reversible government can be impractical. Transactions and investment on the debt reduced only by a moment. This is revolutionary today as it stands at that loss of all ability to decisions. Establishment third parties in office, network using proof of work to record the we. What is the alternative to debt restructuring and government supply-side genes? Not an immemorial process of commerce, allowing meaning with a national simplifying hypothesis for the necessary single consensus. Spectacular power at this time of panic idolizes an ambiguous and baseless exit. Ugly control economics transact directly with institutions to produce merchant societies of order. Scenarios of invalid public sector code avoided by using error in transaction. No internet has come. Any two computational robust payments with more CPU allows for peer-to-peer size coordination of interest rates. Interview responses where people who are willing to explain the unconscious and the physical order as the optimal strategy to make things interesting without a major liberation. Guerrilla waging war, tracing the grids of sentences. A profound sense of a third proletarian politics and senseless struggle as reasonably appropriate meat. The precondition for functioning of the bank is the difference between the genuine fruits of labor and customer deposits in the form of symbolic money. Reserve banking serves a double movement fully covered by the ideology of the exchange value of labor. The individual depositor functions as the incarnation of real value, while the credit money seems to be an important point about the discrepancy of labor. A surplus of ideology sustains the form of government-issued cash, and the symbolic myth for commodity money in the form of gold, at the same time avoiding convertibility at the level of actuality. There is little difference between commercial banks' practical reason from the individual depositor's point of view. According to Marx, the philosophical mechanism of surplus value happens when the capital's reserve is below the difference of actual exploitation or fractional banking to the use value of labor. At this point, it seems to be merely Federal Reserve notes veiled through a simple deception. Hold enough reserves to serve customers as if it were fiat money, and then we might better conceive prices and profit. We should do so. People come to us with a demand for cash at any time, the fantasy for cash. If a person wants to bank money, a symbolic representation performs the relation between exploitation and appropriation. Indeed, in both of the sentences, the philosophical relation of the underlying and the exchange value transaction is 100% cash matter. Fiduciarity is the difference of use value and the definition of ideology. The impossibility of simultaneous redemption of all outstanding value in reserve time. Instead of talking about this discrepancy in terms of use value and exchange value, the way that Marx does, the scheme works making the difference between reserve money and commodity, the difference into cash. If we continue along the lines of Marx, we should ask the simple question: where are these valuable coins? The rise of complacency in 2015 would converge into a centre-left establishment with a short-sighted perspective of stagnation. Hollande's minimum aspirations offer nothing for the possibility but a distributed version of the people identified with the rationality of the power. Power societies being perfectly legitimate to juncture meaning. The economic position of meaning takes the post-crisis country and leads it to silence. The largest need for economics is to trust spreads. The right to resist these imperative policies is nothing controversial. Fraud and not restructure recognizes choice almost exclusively in financial institutions, serving reason to establish nothing. Repeated government time brings decades of burden, rationality, and depression, while rejects the secure need for suffering. The broader cost is served by alleging that the rescheduling of trust-based model can be laid explicit and positive. Unless the fraud is in the government, the Prime Minister ordered to evade with information may rule with a spectacular power over the system of Democrats. Syriza mystified the masses without relying on trust of the usual framework of tragedy. Seminars or academic papers double the magic of our current symbolic practices. To counter the Lehman Brothers economic forecasters was more crowded than usual. The Socialist Merchants Program will leave a big opening to transparency as debt ages to implement the mystification of their crisis above and beyond any meaning. The global consensus parties dismissed a non-reversible debt given the firm economic demand. Messages spontaneously approached in mediating behind this interpretation. Podemos are still far from this scandalous deal. The party will turn contempt to a spectacle of the forces of inversion. The hypothesis for one to watch is opposition to economic elections. Spanish debt accepted instead of trust. And a sustainable counter-strategy, both private and public, finds itself easy to raise mainstream culture. The jurisdiction of the same order predicted GDP as the repressive narcissistic evaluation of the savage in the university. Our thoughts became discourse of professional and even participating in the crisis. Thank you.
Probably it was the first cut-up session after William S. Burroughs. What do you think?
I don't think so.
No? Probably you make a remake with it now. It is retro and young people will follow you. Okay, I want to start this this poem in German. It is called Inselhopping. It is kind of cut-up technique too. It reminds a little bit of the poem of Günter Grass, that writer that we love all so much. It is called Inselhopping. Die mit der Waffen zur Uniform Hölderlin, Volk, dessen Gast du gewesen, den Dank zu schulden, dessen Obristen von dir schreien, der Kommissare Klaköre, weil dem Markt, dessen Reichtum, dessen geistig leidet dein Land, zur Armut verurteiltes, gepflegtes Museum schmückt, nicht gerecht, bist fern du dem Land, das die Wiege dir liebt, dem Chaos nah, als Schuldner nackt, was ist mit der Seele? Gesucht, gefunden, dir galt es, wird abgetan, du rechtloses Land. Dem der Rechthaber machtverwandtes Gefolge fickt alles, was gülden den Gürtel enger und enger schnallet. Dir trotzen trägt Gewalt das inselgesegnete Land, Antigone schwarz und landesweit kleidet Trauer das an den Pranger gestellt. Sauf endlich, sauf! Dein Wille verlangt, wirst du ohne das Land geduldet werden, verfluchtend im Chorus. Kaum noch geduldetes Land, glänzet, hortet, einst als Bündnispartner dir Redensart gewahrt, außer Landes. Doch zornig werden die Götter, von dir gehütete Beute. Gib Sokrates dir es in deinen Tresoren. Critical Art, den Leuten Nerven zerfetzend. Wohlan, nichts geholfen, den Dein gibt es im Schlaf. Geistlos verkümmern, unter Schrottwert taxiert, was eigen dir ist, jedoch hat Europa erdacht. Heimgesucht trugen deren Olymp zu enteignen, den Becher randvoll zurück, den Krösus im Tornister. Danke.
So, do we have time for a Q&A? For questions?
Yes.
So now the question is that if there are any questions.
Do we the physical part after the questions? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I couldn't understand all German text, but I could hear that you refer to Antigone, the myth of Antigone.
Some famous names inside.
Can you hear? So maybe just to join this idea of Antigone with the whole intervention, the idea of Baudrillard, that there is a plane, a symbolic plane, that is...
To observe it.
Yeah, that is somehow unconnected from the reality, from the material reality. And we are moving in this plane of symbolic exchange and desires, you know, imposed by dominant powers. I think it's also trying to join this with the idea of Jacques Lacan, of this, the point de capiton. Maybe some of you know, he said that there is this plane of signifiers, and then they are somehow disconnected from the signifieds.
Yes, a kind of monitoring method, I think.
Sorry?
Monitoring method.
Yeah, this is also connected to the idea of the God, etc.
Yes.
And how this point of de capiton, this kilting point, I think they call it in English, no? This kind of point to join the signifiers and the signified. So my proposal is, and I go briefly, as Antigone did to kind of vindicate a, let's say, a reappropriation of the sacrifice and the celebration of the death, which is also connected to this idea of Baudrillard of the symbolic exchange and death, isn't it?
Yeah, I think your view of this poem is very nice, and I agree with you. But Georgios will tell a little bit much more, because you know a lot about this Antigone stuff. You learned it at school in Greece, so.
Well, the problem is that we don't learn enough Lacan in school about. So, my analysis of money, and I'm moving a little bit in the second part of the discussion, has a lot to do with the point, the capital, the Cretan point. And it's very central in my analysis, because money functions both structurally but also effectively as this kind of point of tension. Because on the one hand is the empty signifier of value that allows us to reduce all other kind of elements to this absolute quantity. And at the same time is the point of effective tension, because it's somehow this point that keeps desire active on the one hand, but also interpolates the subject, this kind of also dichotomy. So in that sense, I would say like money and Antigone come together. The problem in my analysis, or I would say the difficulty that I have to relate with your argument has to do with death. And somehow because economy also maybe doesn't know death, or the problem with economy is that it cannot accept this impossible gift of death. I cannot really put it in my story, but I very much work on this kind of notion of fond de capital.
Some of you might know, some of you might have heard of KLF, Copyright Liberation Front, who were active in the late 80s, early 90s in Britain. It was a duo of two pranksters, Jimmy Corti and Bill Drummond. And since they came up with a formula of how to get a #1 hit on the radio, and already made not £1 and not £2 million. They had a lot of money, and they were thinking of kind of new plans, new provocations, like what to do with those money. At the same, they had different ideas, and one of the first ones was to nail 1 million British pounds onto a canvas to make a painting out of money, and sell it off in a gallery as an artwork for half the actual value of that money nailed on a canvas. So they wanted to sell it off for 500,000. And then the buyer would have had two choices. One is to immediately double the money if they spent the whole million straight away, the million that they bought for half the price, or they could have kept the painting and waited for the value of the artwork to increase, maybe threefold, maybe fivefold in the preceding years. Unfortunately, no gallery took and wanted to risk this provocation, because they didn't think they could afford the security and whatnot. But I think that's very interesting kind of an artwork which is relating to both this discussion and the one we had before. And another question is maybe to Georgios, is to come back to the first part of your talk, where you said that you see artists as maybe the most precarious kind of layer in society. It might come as a provocation, but is it slightly uninformed, or is it dishonest? I mean, if we're talking about people who do €1 jobs in Germany, they're like the only legal working kind of framework is when you're a job and very attractive illegal employment sometimes just reaches €2 an hour. I'm talking about some friends who do not live with a human status in the country. You know, before we even go to talk about, I don't know, Pakistani workers in Dubai or something like that. So,
of course, there is. I can hear your point, but often artists not only they don't get paid for their work, they have to pay the work. So, I'm not saying that it's. What I was trying to argue is that there is a lot of talk in the arts about communism, about emancipation, about how to build another society, how to use art as a vehicle in political struggle. But when we get a discussion about fees, about who gets what, about unpaid work, I don't say there is nothing happening. Yesterday we talked about certain initiatives like the Precarious Workers Brigade, for example, or there is this possibilities or these attempts of people to unionize or to certify institutions. But what I'm saying is that there is a big difference between words and deeds. And I also say that a lot of art workers only invest in terms of time and money in the collective pool of artistic production, but often they don't get anything in return, and they have to work second jobs in order to subsidize or to support their work. And it's, you know, the difference is in very few other sectors people will go and work for free. There is this kind of, I would say, ethos, and there is kind of this ideology of creativity that somehow enforces this kind of conditions of work. And what I wanted to point out is this kind of discrepancy. Of course, you know, one would argue that a lot of artists actually can't have this kind of precarious system because they have a different background, they're often middle class or upper class, or they do it as a hobby and have other work. But that was the point I was making. Of course, they are not the unhappiest lot in the world. But there is this problem.
Yes, I mean, it is the relationship between class and money, which is sometimes a little contradictory, isn't it?
I would say it's more about discourse and how you make sense of what you're doing, and then what is the actual conditions of your existence.
Well, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question because there's one more part, right?
So thank you very much for your talk. I just have a more theoretical question for Georgios, because you mentioned in the beginning of your talk that we could somehow understand value as a social construction, like all the way through. So I was just wondering whether certain relations that we build with objects that have to do with somehow basic human needs, like thirst or hunger, can be explained through this framework. So, for example, when a child needs water, this is pre-discursive, it's pre-symbolical. So I was just wondering whether there are some limits in this radical constructionist like framework in order to analyze certain types of value.
So there are two ways, or I can fall back to two kind of discourses to answer to that, and I will go. So there is the more radical idea of this kind of Lacanian structuralism, where it says that even before the infant comes into life, there is this kind of talk about it. And always the desire of the infant, even if this basic desire, is always unarticulated. And there is this kind of predetermined concepts that the parents have in order to even somehow cater for these very basic desires. So somehow even, thirst or even more like nourishment have somehow already socially constructed. And there is a little bit less radical idea of this kind of production, not only production of commodities, but also the production of the needs that the commodities serve. So what the system does is first produces this need and then at the same time produces the commodity. We have one last part, it's kind of a classic, we do it every time, and it's a bit of an abstract work, it's a kind of a metaphor of the gift economy that characterizes artistic production. And it's very difficult to get, but I'm sure we have a good audience.
In front of the desk.
Yeah, in front. I have to say this is Carsten's favorite part. Before I finish, there is to remind you of capitalism, there is this book that I have. It's €5 if you want. It's a very good edition. And also it's good to support the artist who works so precariously. Thank you. If you want a copy.
I think there are not so much books anymore.
Yeah, it's almost gone. It's the last copies. I have 5 copies. Thank you.